innocent till proven guilty, but usually when the FBI has something, they have you.
At 10:34 a.m. On a rainy October morning, the FBI Assistant Director stood before a packed briefing room in downtown Chicago and delivered a statement that would shake the political establishment to its core. Federal authorities had just dismantled what they called the largest financial fraud and corruption network ever uncovered in the American Midwest. The numbers were staggering beyond comprehension. $21 billion in fraudulent transactions, over $4.7 billion in stolen federal funds, 847 arrests across 11 states, and at the center of it all, a sitting Illinois state representative named Armon Bashir, a 46-year-old foreign-born lawmaker who had spent 12 years building a reputation as a champion of immigrant communities and social justice reform. But behind the press conferences and community events, Bashir was not serving the people. He was commanding a massive criminal syndicate that used state programs, federal grants and non-profit organizations as cover for a sprawling empire of wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and human exploitation that stretched from Chicago to every major city in America. This was not political corruption. This was organized crime wearing a legislator's badge. And what federal investigators discovered in the back rooms of non-profit offices and the encrypted files of shell corporations was not just financial fraud. It was a blueprint for the systematic looting of American taxpayers, while vulnerable communities were used as shields. You think you know how corruption works. You have no idea. And what comes next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about trust, power, and betrayal. It started at 3:17 a.m., 96 hours before that press conference, in the South Loop district of Chicago. The streets were slick with rain. Neon signs reflected off wet pavement. The city was quiet except for the distant hum of the L train rolling through empty stations. No one saw the convoy arrive. 22 black SUVs, silent, deliberate, moving in perfect coordination. Inside were over 140 federal agents, FBI, ICE, IR's Criminal Investigation Division, DIS Fraud Detection Unit, financial crime specialists, computer forensic teams, and SWAT units prepared for high-risk entries. They had been investigating Armon Bashir's network for 19 months, and tonight they were going to tear down the entire operation. The primary target was a 5-story building on South Wabash Avenue, home to the New Horizon Community Foundation, a non-profit organisation founded by Bashir that claimed to provide legal aid, job training, and housing assistance to immigrants and refugees. The foundation had received over $340 million in federal and state grants over the past 8 years. It had been featured in news stories, celebrated at charity galas, praised by politicians, but federal investigators knew the truth. New Horizon was a fraud factory, a money laundering hub, a document forgery centre, and a command post for one of the most sophisticated financial crime networks operating on American soil. At exactly 3:21 a.m, the raid began. Flashbangs shattered the silence. The reinforced front doors exploded inward under breaching charges. SWAT teams flooded the lobby, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. The building was supposed to be empty. It was not. On the second floor, agents found a team of 8 people working at computer terminals, frantically deleting files and shredding documents. They were tackled to the ground before they could finish. On the third floor, agents discovered a document production facility. Industrial printers, laminating machines, blank social security cards, fake driver's licenses, counterfeit immigration documents, forged employment records, templates for fraudulent tax returns. This was not a non-profit office. This was a forgery super lab producing thousands of fake identities per month. On the fourth floor, inside what was supposed to be a conference room, agents found something far more disturbing. Rows of filing cabinets filled with real identities. Names, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, medical records. employment histories, over 340,000 individual identity files, stolen from immigrant communities, asylum seekers, and low-income residents who had come to New Horizons seeking help. These people had trusted Bashir. They had given him their information believing he would protect them. Instead, he had sold their identities to criminal networks across the country, used them to file fraudulent tax returns, applied for fake benefits, opened ghost bank accounts, and created shell identities for money laundering operations. And on the 5th floor, in a locked executive suite, agents found Arman Bashir himself. He was sitting calmly at his desk, dressed in a tailored suit, as if he had been expecting them. On his desk were 3 encrypted laptops, 2 burner phones, and a leather-bound ledger filled with handwritten notes in Farsi and English. Bashir did not resist. He did not speak. He simply smiled as federal agents placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. But the evidence in that office would soon reveal that this was not just one man's crime. It was a state-sponsored operation disguised as public service. Simultaneously, other teams hit 9 additional locations across Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. In Naperville, agents raided a tax preparation business that had been filing thousands of fraudulent returns using stolen identities, claiming false refunds totaling over $680 million. In Schaumburg, a corporate office park was stormed, revealing a network of shell companies registered under fake names that had been awarded $1, $2 billion in government contracts for services that were never performed. In Aurora, a residential home was breached, and agents found $23 million in cash vacuum sealed and hidden inside walls, furniture, and a custom-built safe beneath the garage floor. In Evanston, a luxury apartment overlooking Lake Michigan was searched, yielding financial records linking Bashir to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Dubai, Singapore, and Switzerland. In Cicero, a warehouse registered as a community food bank was raided, and instead of food supplies, agents found pallets of counterfeit documents, fake green cards, and boxes of blank checks tied to fraudulent non-profit accounts. And in downtown Chicago at the Illinois State Capitol Annex building, federal agents served search warrants on Bashir's legislative office, seizing computers, files, and communication records that would soon connect him to a web of corrupt officials, compromised legislators, and cartel-linked operatives who had been using state government as a cover for organized crime. By sunrise, the FBI had arrested 84 individuals, seized over $127 million in cash, frozen 340 bank accounts, and recovered enough evidence to connect Arman Bashir's network to every major financial fraud scheme operating in the Midwest. But the most damning evidence was still buried in the servers. And when federal analysts finally cracked the encryption, they realized they were not looking at a fraud ring. They were staring at a criminal empire built inside the government itself. 18 hours later, inside a secure FBI cyber forensics lab in the Chicago field office, analysts were still trying to comprehend the scale of what they were seeing. The servers seized from New Horizon and Bashir's other fronts contained over 68,000 files. Fraudulent grant applications, fake non-profit filings, shell company registrations, offshore wire transfers, stolen identity databases, and at the center of it all, a master criminal operation with a code name that sent chills through every investigator in the room. Operation Golden Gate. This was not a financial scam. This was a systematic infiltration of federal and state programs designed to extract billions of dollars while using immigrant and refugee communities as human shields. And Arman Bashir was not just a participant. He was the architect. The financial web was almost impossible to follow. Bashir had created 47 shell companies, each one registered under a different fake identity or stolen name. Fake consulting firms, ghost logistics companies, sham construction contractors, fraudulent healthcare providers, non-profit foundations that existed only on paper. The companies had names like Unity Services Group, Midwest Progress Coalition, Liberty Development LLC, New American Ventures, and Horizon Solutions International. Every one of them was fake. Every one of them existed solely to receive government grants, federal contracts, and state funding that was then funneled into offshore accounts and laundered through legitimate businesses, real estate investments, and cryptocurrency exchanges. The money flowed like a river. Over $21 billion in fraudulent transactions had been processed through this network in the past decade. Federal COVID relief funds, small business loans, housing assistance grants, job training programs, immigrant support services, healthcare subsidies, infrastructure contracts. Every dollar that was supposed to help struggling families and vulnerable communities had been stolen, diverted, and laundered through Bashir's empire. But here is where it gets darker. Bashir was not just stealing money, he was weaponizing government programs. The investigators found documentation showing how Bashir's network had systematically exploited federal immigration programs, asylum processing systems, and refugee resettlement initiatives. His operatives would approach newly arrived immigrants and asylum seekers, offering free legal aid, housing assistance, and job placement through New Horizon and other front organizations. In exchange, the immigrants would provide their personal information, sign documents they did not understand, and unknowingly authorize Bashir's network to use their identities for fraud. Fake tax returns were filed in their names, false benefit claims were submitted, bank accounts were opened without their knowledge, and when federal investigators came looking, the immigrants were the ones who got arrested, deported, or prosecuted, while Bashir remained untouchable behind his legislative immunity and public reputation as a defender of the vulnerable. The cyber forensics team kept digging, and then they found the connection that made everything clear. A digital signature. An encrypted authorization key embedded in hundreds of financial transactions, grant approvals, and legislative directives. The key was linked directly to Arman Bashir's legislative office. But it was not just his signature, it was also linked to 11 other individuals, state legislators, city officials, federal grant administrators, and even 2 ICE supervisors who had been approving asylum applications and refugee placements that fed directly into Bashir's fraud network. This was not corruption, this was command-level collusion. Bashir had turned the Illinois state legislature into a clearinghouse for organized crime. He had used his position as a lawmaker to pass bills that increased funding for programs his network controlled. He had served on oversight committees that audited the very organizations he owned. He had written policy recommendations that weakened fraud detection systems and reduced accountability measures. And he had done it all while standing in front of cameras giving speeches about justice, equity, and the American dream. This is not negligence. This is engineered treason. And the operation had just begun at 5:46 a.m. The following morning, inside a joint federal task force command center established at the FBI Chicago headquarters, over 70 federal officials stood in front of a massive digital map of Illinois and the surrounding Midwest. The screen was covered in red markers. Each one represented a location tied to Operation Golden Gate. Fake non-profits, shell companies, fraudulent businesses, money laundering hubs, document forgery centers, compromised officials. The markers stretched across Chicago, Springfield, Peoria, Rockford, and into neighboring states including Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Missouri, and Iowa. This was not a Chicago problem. This was a regional crisis, and it required a regional response. The mission was given a name: Operation Clean Ledger. The objective was total dismantling. Over 1,600 federal agents were mobilized. FBI, ICE, IRS criminal investigation, Secret Service, DETS, US Marshals, financial crimes task forces, computer forensic teams, document analysis specialists, and even elements of the US Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois deployed prosecutors to begin filing charges in real time as evidence was secured. This was not a raid. This was a systematic takedown of a criminal empire that had been hiding inside the government for over a decade. At exactly 6:00 a.m., the operation launched. In Chicago, agents stormed a high-rise office building in the Loop, where Bashir's network had established a fake consulting firm that had been awarded $340 million in state infrastructure contracts for projects that were never started. Agents seized financial records, arrested 12 executives, and froze accounts containing over $87 million. In Springfield, the state capital, federal teams raided the offices of 3 state legislators who had been receiving monthly payments from Bashir's shell companies in exchange for pushing through grant approvals and blocking oversight legislation. The legislators were arrested in their offices, their staff members were detained, and their computers were seized, revealing communications that proved they knew exactly what they were doing. In Rockford, a network of fake tax preparation offices was shut down simultaneously by heirs and FBI teams. Agents arrested 34 individuals and seized servers containing stolen identity data for over 120,000 people. In Peoria, a residential neighborhood was locked down as agents raided 6 homes used as document production facilities, where stolen identities were being converted into fraudulent benefit claims and fake business filings. In Gary, Indiana, just across the state line, agents hit a logistics company that had been used to launder money through fake shipping contracts. They seized $14 million in cash and arrested the CEO, a close associate of Bashir who had been funneling money to offshore accounts in Dubai. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a healthcare billing company was raided, revealing a scheme where Bashir's network had been submitting fraudulent Medicaid and Medicare claims using stolen patient identities, billing for services that were never provided, and pocketing over $560 million in federal healthcare funds. In Detroit, Michigan, agents arrested 2 federal grant administrators who had been approving funding applications for Bashir's fake non-profits without conducting any due diligence, in exchange for cash payments and luxury vacations. And in St. Louis, Missouri, a real estate investment firm was stormed, and agents discovered that Bashir's network had been using stolen identities and fraudulent loan applications to purchase over 200 properties, which were then used as collateral for additional loans that were never repaid, creating a cascading fraud scheme that cost banks and federal lenders over $890 million. By mid-afternoon, the map had changed. Red markers were turning blue, locations secured, suspects in custody, accounts frozen, evidence seized. The numbers kept climbing. 847 arrests across 11 states, over $4.7 billion in stolen funds recovered or frozen, properties, bank accounts, businesses, shell companies dismantled. And it was not just criminals being dragged out in handcuffs, it was elected officials, state employees, federal administrators, and community leaders who had sworn to serve the public, but had chosen to serve themselves. The financial underworld took more damage in 8 hours than it had in the last 8 years. But the real betrayal was still coming. Back at the command center, federal investigators were combing through the servers seized from Bashir's network. And what they found was a betrayal so deep it made even hardened financial crimes agents feel sick. The cartel had not just infiltrated Illinois government, it had infiltrated federal immigration enforcement. 41 officials across ICE, US Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the Department of Labor were on Arman Bashir's payroll. Immigration officers who approved asylum applications for individuals who were actually cartel operatives. Grant administrators who rubber-stamped funding for fake non-profits. Labor Department officials who certified fraudulent job training programs. Even 2 federal judges who had been dismissing fraud cases and immigration violations in exchange for monthly payments of $50,000 each, delivered through encrypted cryptocurrency wallets that were nearly impossible to trace. The investigators pulled up the logs. They saw it all. Asylum applications approved without background checks. Grant disbursements processed without verification. Fraud investigations closed without explanation. Deportation orders overturned. Evidence suppressed. Witnesses intimidated. It was not just a few corrupt officials. It was a parallel enforcement system. A shadow government that operated inside the real one, controlled not by law, but by Arman Bashir and the network he commanded. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when agents reviewed the case file of an honest ICE investigator who had flagged suspicious patterns in asylum approvals coming out of Chicago 3 years earlier. The investigator filed a detailed report, requested a full audit, and was reassigned to a desk job processing paperwork within 2 weeks. The investigation was closed, the suspicious approvals continued, and over the next 3 years, Bashir's network brought in over 4,200 individuals using fraudulent asylum claims, many of whom were then used as identity mules for fraud schemes, while real refugees were denied entry because the system was too overwhelmed to process legitimate cases. The investigator did his job. The system betrayed him, and thousands of people, both those exploited and those denied help, paid the price. Federal agents moved quickly. They arrested the corrupt officials in coordinated dawn raids across Illinois, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. No warnings, no leaks. They were taken into custody at their homes, at their desks, in federal buildings. The badge does not make you immune. It makes your betrayal unforgivable. And the system that allowed a foreign-born state lawmaker to build a $21 billion fraud empire while sitting in the legislature, while serving on oversight committees, while writing laws that protected his own crimes, that system was about to be burned to the ground and rebuilt with transparency, accountability, and consequence. But the full picture was still emerging, because Armand Bashir's plan was not just about stealing money, it was about building power. The investigators zoomed out. They pulled up a continental network map that had been hidden in Bashir's encrypted files, and the scale of what they were seeing was almost incomprehensible. Operation Golden Gate was designed to turn Illinois into the primary hub for financial fraud, identity theft, and illegal immigration processing across the entire Midwest and eventually the nation. The network used a combination of legitimate government programs, non-profit cover, and political influence to move money, identities, and people without detection. Federal grants were applied for using fake non-profits. The applications were approved by compromised administrators. The money was dispersed into shell company accounts. From there, it was transferred through a web of offshore banks, cryptocurrency exchanges, and real estate investments that made it nearly impossible to trace. Once the money was clean, it was reinvested into legitimate businesses, political campaigns, and additional non-profit ventures that applied for even more funding. It was a self-sustaining cycle, a perpetual fraud machine. The network moved an estimated $180 million per month. That is over $2.1 billion per year. And over the course of a decade, it had extracted over $21 billion from federal and state programs, stolen identities from over 340,000 individuals, and compromised the integrity of immigration systems, social services, and government contracting across 11 states. Immigrant communities that came seeking help were turned into fraud victims. Federal programs designed to support struggling families were looted, and taxpayers funded it all, while Bashir stood in the state legislature and voted on budgets, passed laws, and smiled for the cameras. The final piece of the puzzle came from a file buried deep in the server archives. It was labelled Phase 5. The investigators opened it, and what they read made them realise that everything they had dismantled so far was just the foundation. Phase 5 was Armand Bashir's endgame. He was not content to run a fraud network. He wanted to control entire cities. The plan detailed how Bashir's operatives would run for local office in cities across Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, and Iowa. They would campaign as community leaders, champions of immigrants, advocates for social justice, and once elected, they would use their positions to award contracts to Bashir's shell companies, appoint allies to oversight boards, defund fraud investigation units, and pass local ordinances that protected the network from federal enforcement. The goal was to create cartel-controlled cities where the local government itself was a criminal enterprise, insulated by layers of political legitimacy, protected by sympathetic media coverage, and funded by stolen taxpayer money. This was not infiltration. This was colonization. And if Phase 5 had succeeded, entire regions of the Midwest would have become fraud empires, where public office was a criminal position, where government programs were criminal enterprises, and where the law itself was a tool of organized crime. The system was not broken, it was being redesigned. And Armin Bashir was the architect. But here is the thing about power. It does not always come with guns and violence. Sometimes it comes in a suit and tie. Sometimes it speaks the language of justice and compassion. Sometimes it hides behind the very causes we are taught to support. And that is when it is most dangerous. Because you do not see it until it has taken everything. Until it has turned your trust into a weapon. Until it has used your compassion as a shield. Armin Bashir understood that. He knew that no one would suspect a foreign-born lawmaker, a champion of immigrants, of commanding a $21 billion fraud empire. He knew that his identity, his story, and his political platform were his greatest protections. And he used them. For over a decade. Until the FBI tore those protections apart and dragged the truth into the light. The cost of this operation, the real cost, cannot be measured in billions of dollars or thousands of arrests. It is measured in lives. In the immigrant family in Chicago who came to New Horizons seeking legal help and ended up with their identities stolen, their credit destroyed, and federal charges filed against them for fraud they did not commit. In the single mother in Rockford who applied for housing assistance through one of Bashir's fake non-profits and had her social security number used to file fraudulent tax returns, resulting in a legitimate refund being seized and her children going without food. In the asylum seeker in Springfield who trusted Bashir's network to process his case and was instead used as a mule for document fraud, then deported when the scheme was discovered. In the honest ICE agents, ears investigators, and federal auditors who flagged the fraud and were silenced, reassigned, or forced out. In the communities across the Midwest that were promised help and received exploitation. That is the cost. And it is unforgivable. This story is a warning. It is a reminder that corruption does not always look like cartels and drug lords. Sometimes it looks like a non-profit. Sometimes it looks like a legislator. Sometimes it looks like someone who speaks your language, understands your struggle, and promises to fight for you. And that is when you have to look closer. Because the people who exploit trust are the most dangerous criminals of all. The FBI, ICE, EARS, and every honest agent who participated in Operation Clean Ledger did what needed to be done. They exposed the fraud, they dismantled the network, and they proved that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how protected by politics or identity, is above the law. If you are still watching this, tap like so more people see this story. Share it, because the public needs to know that $21 billion was stolen from programs meant to help the vulnerable, and the man who did it was sitting in the state legislature voting on budgets and writing laws. Comment expose if you want corruption like this dragged into the light, because silence is what allows criminals to hide behind legitimacy. Financial fraud, identity theft, and political corruption are not victimless crimes. They destroy lives, they break families, and they erode the trust that holds society together. Armin Bashir is in federal custody. His network is dismantled. His empire is ash. But the fight is not over. Because for every operation like this that gets exposed, there are others still running, still stealing, still exploiting, still using government programs as cover, still hiding behind political office. The question is not whether it is happening. The question is whether we are willing to see it, and whether we are willing to demand accountability from everyone, no matter who they are or what cause they claim to represent. That is the real story, and that is why you need to keep watching. Keep asking questions, keep demanding transparency, because the moment we stop paying attention is the moment they rebuild, and the next network will be smarter, more hidden, more dangerous. That is the truth, and it is up to all of us to make sure it never gets that far again.